subjects of argument and narrative are two that I consider both interesting and important. They're similar in so many ways that it's uncanny, but are structurally different enough to where they inherently feel like they're not the same thing. Understanding how they compare and contrast may be one of the easiest ways to learn the basics of composing either one. Now, the subjects I discuss are in a field that people have devoted entire careers and lives to yelling at each other about, but I'm going to put my take on it in a 20-minute video. Also, let me mention that the models I present are not all-inclusive. There is nuance to be sure, but these are base-level models that an argument and a narrative should contain. So where do we start? Well, we could start here. What is an argument, and what is storytelling? Let's start with the basics. An argument has many definitions, so let's discuss a few. An argument is A process of deductive or inductive reasoning that purports to show its conclusion to be true. B, formally, a sequence of statements, one of which is a conclusion and the remainder is premises. Basically, it's a conclusion and an explanation of how you came to it. And lastly, we have C, a point or a series of points that support or oppose a proposition. There's also another that really sounds like it belongs here, and that's the summary of a plot or subject of a book, poem, etc. But ignore that, that's not actually relevant. Now, what is a story? A story is defined as a plot or succession of incidents in a novel, poem, drama, etc. Now, that's not exactly true, as a story and a plot are two slightly different things, but we'll get to that later. So we said we're going to be talking about structure, so let's talk structure. One model of understanding an argument breaks into 5 basic elements, most of which are pretty easy to understand, but one in particular requires a little explanation, and that's element number 1, the claim. What are you claiming? This is what you assert and seek to prove. Now, in an essay, this is called a thesis, or a proposition stated or put forward for consideration, especially one to be discussed and proved to be maintained against objections. Again, this is what you're claiming and trying to prove. Now, a thesis, or at least a good one, has several qualities. It is not simply a statement of fact, it shows cause and effect. Basically, how or why something is so. Is specific. It tells the reader, listener, audience, etc. what to expect will be discussed throughout an argument, and should in turn be supported by evidence throughout the paper. Lastly, it should also be at least somewhat controversial, otherwise what's the point of you making an argument for it? I don't need your master's thesis on why random stabbings are bad. I think most of us already know that, so what's the bloody point of you telling me? Element number 2, reason. What reason do you have for believing your claim? Element number 3, evidence. What evidence do you base those reasons on? Now, this is different than reason. Take the random stabbing example from before. I claim that random stabbings are bad because they cause pain. Because they cause pain is my reason. Now, as evidence, I could use statistics, or whatever, or I could just stab you. It'd be a lot less effort on my part, even if it did make me a hypocrite. Element number 4, warrant. What principle connects or makes your reason relevant to your claim? Continuing our example from before, let's say that my warrant is that if something makes you bleed and scream, it causes pain. I stabbed you and it made you scream and bleed. Screaming and bleeding is indicative of pain, and pain is bad. Therefore, stabbing people is bad. Lastly, element number 5, acknowledgement and response. What about potential disagreements A, B, or C? For example, what if there was already a knife in my leg, and I had to cut it out with another knife? I'm not actually going to argue against this, but an important part, and perhaps the most important part of an argument, is considering every possible exception to your claim. If you find even one that your argument can't refute, you need to go back and rethink your position. So let's talk about narrative now. Together, a story and a plot make up a narrative, but they are different parts of it. Put simply,
a story is just a series of events. A plot is a reason why these events are occurring. A plot connects these events together, making them logical. B follows A and not C or D, and the story shows or tells us why. Plots come from characters. Characters behave a certain way because of their motives. Thus, essentially, plots are character motives. Classically, the two characters we should be most concerned with in a story are the protagonist and the antagonist. As their individual plots intersect, conflicts arise. A theme is what a story is about. All themes should require conflict. A good theme, like man versus himself, should change something about that character, like the protagonist's or antagonist's perspective. This is called character development.
What this basically means is that if characters didn't feel a certain way, they wouldn't act a certain way. If they didn't take certain actions, then the plot would not occur. Themes are given rise when conflicts occur, for example good versus evil, and how a character deals with and reacts to this conflict shows which side of the theme they are on and characterizes them. All of this may not happen, and you may just tell a story, that is, just a series of events that may or may not be connected in any sensible manner without any meaning to them. But that's not necessarily a narrative, and it's not good writing. Now, a narrative is composed of 6 basic elements. Element number 1, premise. This is a story's core dramatic issue, the movement of that issue towards a resolution, and the fulfillment that that resolution sets out for a story's audience. That is not the conclusion, but the setup for a conclusion. This is what the narrative is about. So, in Lord of the Rings, evil, led and inspired by Sauron, is threatening Middle-earth. His ring must be taken to Mount Doom by the forces of good to be destroyed so that he will be destroyed. Another literal definition of the premise is a statement that is assumed to be true for the purpose of argument from which a conclusion is drawn. This is starting to get interesting. Element number 2, orientation. This is the identification of time, place, persons, and their activity or situation. It's basically exposition. This includes a description of the main character and is generally charged with informing the reader on the protagonist and the setting. For example, Frodo is a happy hobbit who lives in the Shire, which is in Middle-earth and is set in the Third Age. He shares these qualities with his kinsmen, the hobbits, who differ from other races, though he differs from his kinsmen in these ways for these reasons, blah-de-blah-de-blah. This is where characterization starts. As a basic rule of thumb, not all character motives have to be explained, and not all character traits have to be explained. If they are abnormal, not inherent, or are contradictory to what someone would do in that situation, however, they do. You don't have to tell me why Gandalf is courageous, but you do have to tell me why he came to the Shire, how he knows magic, why he pities Gollum, and how he was resurrected. Now, don't tell me, but show me, and in games, it can be a mix of do and show. This stage is where characterization begins. Character motives should be clear, consistent, and not change from scene to scene without conflict. Element number 3, complicating incident. This is the first part or core of the plot, which sets up what the narrative will resolve. Without one, there's no narrative. Nothing happens. If Frodo spends all his time in the Shire smoking and reading without any conflict at all, then the story is not worth telling. Which brings us to element number 4, evaluation. This is the storyteller's commentary on why the story is tellable. Evaluative comments are also known as themes, which, as we've discussed, come from conflict. These happen throughout the narrative and can be both complementary and supplementary. That is, they can expand on or go with themes that are already existing. You can mix themes quite easily, but you need to be careful about the tones they create. Contradictory tones will confuse the audience if they are too close together in a narrative and or they are switched in between constantly. And that's generally just bad writing. Element number 5, result or conclusion. This is the final culmination of events in a narrative where the problem introduced by the complicating incident is resolved. This is literally the conclusion of a story, so to speak. Finally, we come to element number 6, the coda or denouement. This is the literal final statement or action that ends a story. In a good story, this is an outro that leaves the reader, viewer, player with a sense that the story has been concluded. So, how does this tie together in any way? Well, think of it like this. A plot is the author convincing you that a premise has occurred. So the plot is the reason that the premise has occurred. Because the plot is the reason for believing your premise, and plot comes from characters who behave a certain way because of their motives and or traits, the traits and or motives are the warrants connecting your story to the premise. You believe that a premise has happened because these events happened because these characters behaved this way, because they feel and are this way, because they lived in this sort of place, with these sort of people who behaved this sort of way, because they feel and are this way. So because orientation is responsible for how a character behaved, it is also a warrant. Because a plot is warranted by characters behaving a certain way, we can say that the complicating incident is a part of the plot, and is thus a reason. Now, a theme is a subject that comes up when your warrants or plot is occurring, which of course come from characters. So it can be said that the more complex or diverse the characters are, the more themes will come up, which is good. We like when lots of subjects are covered. As such, it can be said that the more arguments in the warrant for your premise, the more complex your narrative is. Complexity is a good thing because character motives should be clear. Unclear character motives are only okay when certain motives are hidden for the sake of mystery. So if narratives are just big arguments, why do we find them so interesting? Well, there's lots of reasons, not all of which I'll cover here, and not all of which can be answered because our brains are very, very complex. But I believe it's due to the fact that in an argument the conclusion is basically the same thing as a claim, where we're engaged by that something has changed in a narrative. A narrative starts with exposition and ends on the conclusion or coda. There's an arc that we've been brought over as the warrants inform us on the characters and setting over the course of the narrative. In a narrative, the conclusion is not told to the audience, whereas in an argument, it has been. The audience ideally doesn't know how a narrative is going to end, so the build of exposition and character throughout it brings the audience on a journey, which is pervasive with most of the general premises and themes of most narratives. These journeys show themes of discovering, losing, working towards, and or working against, etc. something. They relate to a character because it has been warranted, because they feel a certain way, then learn or change after taking a side on a theme. They feel human. Similarly, a complex and interesting lore comes from a complex and interesting series of warrants that makes that races, factions, or objects' motivations and reasons for being in a narrative, doing what they are doing, believable. All these elements that make us like a character are because the warrants of a narrative have made us like them, made us care for them, and in a good solid plot, all the warrants leading into our identification with a character make logical sense when analyzed. Like an argument, the warrants of a narrative must stand up to empirical scrutiny. They have to make sense. This fact, coupled with the fact that a narrative opens with its warrants, is why a plot analysis starts at the beginning of a story. It can be analyzed. A narrative can look like this, this, or this. It can be about space, revenge, love, or hope, but it must contain the elements we've discussed, otherwise it's just a series of loosely connected events. It lacks meaning or structure. We like when stories mean things, so we like narratives. You can also like a narrative that's missing some of its warrants, or its warrants are contradictory. It's bad writing, but you can still like it. People, of course, are going to have differing opinions on what makes up a narrative, and what makes a narrative as opposed to a story or plot. If you have one, leave a comment, or even make a video response if you find enough wrong with what I said. I think calling each other out on our crap is important, so feel free to do it. But do make sure to follow the argument structure I laid out.